All I do each night is pray, hoping that I'll be a part of you again someday. And all I do each night is think of all the times I close the door to keep my love within. Hello and welcome to Ellroy Reads. And if you're curious, I haven't joined Take That. I am actually going to be talking about Loofah by John Osborne. And this is a very special episode of Ellroy Reads because of all the texts we've done before. We've done novels and we've done true crime and we've done biography, but we've never actually done a play before. And it's also really an episode about James Ellroy's faith. So I guess if you're offended by religion or anything remotely controversial, turn off now. But if you're offended by anything remotely controversial, you wouldn't be watching Ellroy Read, so stay tuned. Okay, so let's give a little bit of background. John Osborne started his career and worked very briefly. He's an English playwright, but he worked briefly first as a journalist, and then he moved into the theatre where he worked as a stage manager and an actor. But he really found fame as a playwright. In fact, he was dirt poor, living from hand to mouth, until the sudden success of Look Back in Anger in the late 1950s, and that completely changed the British post-war theatre scene. Before that, plays by Terence Rattigan were very popular, R.C. Sheriff, people like that. Plays that really looked at middle-class problems, upper middle-class virtues and vices. Whereas Look Back in Anger was really about the working class, and its selling point was the energy and the rhythm of the anger of the lead characters, particularly Jimmy. And Osborne really was an angry man himself. In fact, him and his movement became known as the Angry Young Man movement. And at the time, RADA and British theatre kind of got many of the upper middle class kind of virtues, such as speaking received pronunciation and being taught that was the only way for actors to behave in their manners and also in their voice, really got swept away, and a new generation of playwrights came in. Osborne's success continued for a while with plays like A Patriot for Me and The Entertainer, Inadmissible Evidence, The Hotel in Amsterdam, and of course this one, Loofah. But by the 1970s, he was beginning to run out of steam, and the plays began to receive very badly. The Sense of an Ending, West of Suez, The End of My Old Cigar, Watch It All Come Down, all flops. And Osborne himself began to change and went through a very, very interesting change in terms of whereas in his youth he'd been kind of an angry young man, although he hated that label, but he had been a Labour man, and once he got money, he was the Champagne Socialist, he was a member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, all the fashionable left-wing causes. But by the 1970s, he began to change. He expressed admiration for the anti-immigrant views of Enoch Powell, and he became what's sometimes referred to a very small club known as the kind of Tory anarchist club, of which Ellroy would fit in quite nicely. So more on that a little bit later, but a real sense of kind of usually libertarian views, usually distaste towards the kind of left-wing dominance in the culture scene, and by no means a dyed-in-the-wool Tory or a dyed-in-the-wool Republican in Ellroy's case, but certainly kind of conservative, almost with a rebellious streak. And Osborne had another thing in common with Ellroy, which was his fondness for the ladies. He was married 5 times. He treated his first 4 wives abominably. He was unfaithful and cruel. He kind of met his match with his fourth wife, Jill Bennett, who was equally cruel to him. But after the divorce, Jill Bennett ended her own life. Another of Osborne's ex-wives ended her life. And Osborne was extremely cruel in the press. He'd been gagged by a restraining order for some years, but he said some extremely cruel things to her over a woman who just ended her life. And Osborne was like that, I guess. He was libertine as well as libertarian. And his only biological daughter he was estranged from, if you read a biography of Osborne, that the mystery of their estrangement stemmed from the fact that she didn't express enough interest in his famous friends, such as Laurence Olivier, because she was a teenage girl and she had a crush on Mel Gibson and the heartthrobs of the era, and that led to their estrangements. Believe it or not, there is quite an academic case laid out in Osborne's biography that was the cause of their estrangement. So perhaps you wouldn't like John Osborne as a person. There's lots of reasons to dislike him. When you actually see him in interviews, and in fact in the excellent documentary, three-part documentary, John Osborne, The Gift of Friendship, he does actually come across just with this kind of distance, that you're not like part of his life. But in terms of his anecdotes and in terms of his ability to hold an audience just with his voice and his gift for storytelling, he does come across as very, very entertaining and catty. In fact, there's a wonderful put down in the hotel in Amsterdam, one of his play from 1968, with an absolutely scathing speech someone says to a former friend. And that was actually based on a letter Osborne wrote to his collaborator, Tony Richardson, of the famous Richardson dynasty, Jolie, Natasha, and then actors and wonderful actors and directors came from that family. And they had a falling out as well, but it is very entertaining. His pen was dipped in acid, and that's kind of another thing he had in common with Ellroy, because as Ellroy's biographer and as someone who probably knows him as well as anybody else, I can tell there were some falling outs, and some of them were absolutely epic, and Ellroy would not hold back when he took a dislike to someone. But anyway, so having described Osborne and Ellroy in absolutely less than flattering terms, does it come as a surprise to you that they were both Christian? Well, Osborne, at the peak of his power, in 1961, Luther debuted his play on the life of Martin Luther, and it was a big success. It made a star of Albert Finney in the title role. It was directed by Tony Richardson, who I just mentioned, and it is a really, really important play, both in Osborne's career and also in James Ellroy's life and his faith. Okay, so the story takes place. We meet Martin Luther when he is a member of a Augustinian order in Erfurt, Germany. I think I pronounced that correctly. If I haven't, apologies to any German viewers. And he is extremely pious and introspective to the extent where it is killing him. He cannot really function as a human being because he is so wound tight with the thought of sin. Every lustful thought, every stray curse, or the sort of normal things that actually humans, especially at certain points in their biological development, have, are killing him. And it's played quite funnily. I read this and I was laughing quite a lot on my daily commute. The other commuters were looking at me funny, but it is very funny because there's a very early scene where the monks are confessing their sins, and these sins are so pitiful that you can't help but laugh at, and they start to outdo each other. They start to say, no, I sin much more than that. No, I deserve much more of a bigger punishment. And it almost reads like the Four Yorkshiremen sketch made famous by Monty Python. That's very funny. Look it up if you haven't seen it. So after a while, Luther becomes increasingly disillusioned with the Catholic Church. But of course, the people who love him are disillusioned with him. His father, Hans, has done quite well and become quite middle class through his work and his investments in the mining industry. And he's really disappointed in his son that he has chosen the religious life rather than a more worldly life. And also, the Vicar General of the Order, von Staupitz, apologies if I got that wrong as well, a real life historical figure, Staupitz, let's call him, is worried about Luther. He says, "You're too introspective. I want you to, study the scripture. I'm really worried about, you just not functioning as a human being, just becoming too, well, really, probably mental illness, or probably low mental health, low mood, depressive moods that we would describe it today." So he does, and obviously he begins to see the corruption in the Catholic Church, particularly indulgences. The big villain in this piece is Tetzel, who's just like this very hissable villain who's selling indulgences. He's making himself rich. He's fathered numerous children, even though he's supposed to be celibate. And Staupitz really begins to regret his advice because it gets to the point where the Protestant Reformation is just starting because of Luther's work and the work of others who do get mentioned here, people like Erasmus and Henry VIII. And he says, if you carry on this road, you're going to tear Christendom apart. But nevertheless, Luther does, and he goes from being internally conflicted and, just like a barely functioning human being whose job was to clean out the latrines in the monastery, to this kind of demagogic figure who's just like the father of the Reformation and all of the changes that happen in the world. And then eventually it comes to the time of the Peasants' Revolt, and Luther refuses to back it, even though many of the people who admired him are behind it, and they have taken him as inspiration, even if he doesn't back it. And by this time, he's become disillusioned in another way, because a knight says to him, "Well, you challenged the authority of the church, and you said we need to put Scripture above the church. And but what if the next step is that we realize that Scripture is just words, it's just poetry?" And then you see the seeds of the next Reformation. So it's almost a kind of atheistic view of the world, but also a kind of Tory atheistic view of the world, because it's saying, yes, the Reformation is very important historically. It gave us it gave us the documents that we needed, particularly in Britain and in America, and the kind of almost any way you think of the Anglosphere, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the kind of, it gave us the Christian foundation, but ultimately the next logical step to that is towards secularism. So it's a really, really interesting play, and we see Luther at the end with his young bride and his child, and all of it, the relationship with the father, the relationship with the church, and his inner relationship are just really, really powerful. And I would have loved to have seen this on stage, especially with Albert Finney in a star-making turn. Think of, Finney's tremendous power as an actor, the passion he brought to the role, the passion he would bring to Luther, the man who's been constrained by living this monastic life and eventually breaks free of it, and he does get worldly, can take a wife and everything. And actually Finney, this was the role that made him famous in the theatre, but the role that made him famous on screen, which was Tom Jones, was also directed by Tony Richardson and scripted by John Osborne. The three of them had one hell of a trinity of collaborators going for a while. Of course, they did fall out. This is Ellroy reads. I mean, what more do you expect from a show like this? But so the play was very important. It's been revived a few times. It hasn't been revived in a while. Osborne has become rather unfashionable. There is the occasional revival of Inadmissible Evidence and Look Back in Anger. But probably the easiest version you could see, if you want to go out and watch it after this, is the 1974 film starring Stacy Keach as Luther, and that's very good. And it was part of the American Film Theatre production of films. They made about 25 films. They were all film stage plays. They weren't made to become cinematic. They were made to have a theatre atmosphere. And there were 2 seasons, and you actually bought a ticket for the entire season. So you'd have to see 12 films or so. But they were full of terrific stars, and they had terrific directors. And most of them turned out really well. Luther did, and Stacy Keach is very good. The only thing is, I thought it could have been a bit funnier, the film, because I was reading this and I was laughing a lot. But when I watched the film, I wasn't laughing as much. It might be because I'd watched the film afterwards. I could see the lines coming. But there's stuff on this about Luther being frequently constipated and him being flatulent. And he even says, if I break wind in Wittenberg, perhaps they'd smell it in Rome. There are really funny lines here. And I didn't think the film quite captured that. But Keach is really good. He made a few films in Britain. The Squeeze is one of them, and a couple of others. And he actually did time in a British prison in Reading Prison for drugs. That's an interesting story for another time. But Ellroy first mentions this in his 1998 essay, Let's Twist Again, for GQ, in which that essay was about him organising a school reunion for John Burroughs Junior High School, which he'd attended. He said that the only school he was ever happy at. And the reunion went really well. And even though it was a predominantly Jewish school, there were a couple of Christian attendees like Ellroy. And one of them, Howard Swansea, had become quite a well-known pastor in the Los Angeles area. And afterwards, Ellroy went to Swansea's church. And in the essay, he says, it's actually the first time I visited a church since my mother dragged me along unwillingly to First Dutch Lutheran as a child. You know, Ellroy's roots are very strictly Lutheran. He knows about this Protestant ethic, and it's very, very important to him, even when he wasn't necessarily a believer. I know for much of his life he wasn't a believer. He is now. He actually makes fun of Swansea's church a little bit, all the fire and brimstone. There's a moment in the essay where he catches sight of a little black boy who's clearly bored and dragged along with his parents, and he winks at him, and they share this moment. It's very special where he's like, "Look, I know this is kind of crazy, but listen, you're gonna have one hell of a life. You're gonna have a wild life. Just put up with this now, and it's really gonna kick off." They have that moment together. It's one of my favorite Ellroy autobiographical pieces. But subsequent Ellroy became very, very conservative in his Christian views, you know, and he's attended a number of churches. He was when we were working on the biography, he was attending an Episcopalian church, but he wasn't conservative enough for him. They were playing too many DVDs and this and that, and he wanted to go back. Let's say to his roots. Actually, he became very, very interested in the Salvation Army because they had helped him during the 70s, during some of his lowest moments. He was making donations to a Salvation Army church in Denver where he lives still. And he's reading the theology books of Timothy Keller, which are definitely on the conservative side. So he's become much more interested, but he mentions John Osborne's Luther in the Let's Twist Again essay. And he says, look, modern Luther, according to John Osborne, changed the world because he was frustrated he couldn't get laid and he was constipated all the time. A little bit of simplification, but he's like, that's me. I'm John Osborne's Luther. And then more recently, he was in a podcast interview when he was promoting The Enchanters, and he said, I've always loved John Osborne's Luther. In fact, I've got a big speech of it, a very passionate speech of it, in my study, you know, which I go back to. And so it's been 30 plus years, over 30 years that I know that he's been talking about how much he loves John Osborne's play Luther. And obviously the Christian side of Ellroy, his faith, isn't going to appeal to everyone. A lot of Ellroy readers will be like, no, forget it, move on. But if it's of any interest to you, you know, his Lutheran upbringing, his Protestant ethic, just his feelings about Christianity and God in general, you know, read this play, go out and get yourself a copy. You can get one very cheap on eBay, or watch the 1974 film, which is on YouTube. It's very, you know, the copyright's expired. It's very, very interesting, and I think, you know, it will appeal perhaps to people who wouldn't necessarily read the work of someone who calls himself the Demon Dog, and just ponder, as I have, just that contradiction in both Ellroy and Osborne in terms of all of the womanizing, all of the Osborne as well. Drink was his big flaw; it killed him in the end. All of the vices that they had, and yet they still needed to have this faith. Okay, thank you very much for watching Ellroy Reads. And if you excuse me, I've got that audition to go back to. Okay, bye-bye. See you next time.